Dry Creek, Texas. Summer, 1882. A woman on her knees in the middle of the main street. Suitcase cracked open beside her. Red dust rising slow around her skirt like the earth itself, was deciding whether to swallow her whole, the whole town watching. Nobody moving. A door slammed behind her hard enough to rattle glass. A voice cut across the heat. And don't come back. Still nobody moved. Then boots, slow, deliberate. Not away from her, toward her. A man crouched down in the dirt of that street and looked her straight in the eye. Not down at her. Not past her. At her. Something shifted in the crowd. Something that had no name yet but was already dangerous, because in Dry Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1882, a man who crouched down in public dirt for a woman like her wasn't making a gesture. He was making a choice. And choices like that had consequences nobody in that crowd was ready for. Dry Creek, Texas. Summer, 1882. The road baked not warm, not hot. Baked the way a clay pot bakes in a kiln, the way the earth itself had given up pretending it was anything other than a furnace floor dressed up with dust and dead grass. The main street ran straight and merciless under a sun that had been trying to kill something since 6 in the morning and wasn't finished. Storefronts threw short shadows. The livery smelled of hot straw and unhappy animals. A dog had found a patch of shade under the feed store steps and was not moving for any reason whatsoever. None of that mattered. And what mattered was the woman in the blue dress kneeling in the middle of the road, not sitting, not crouching, kneeling the way a person kneels when their legs have simply stopped cooperating with whatever their pride had planned. The suitcase had gone down beside her, one hinge catching wrong against the packed dirt. A small cloud of red dust rising around the hem of her skirt like the earth was trying to swallow her slow and didn't want anyone to notice. Her hands were pressed flat against the road. Her chin was up, and that was the thing nobody standing on those boardwalks seemed to know what to do with. Chin. Because women who got thrown out of inns in front of the whole town were supposed to crumble, were supposed to make it easy, were supposed to give the audience the collapse they'd gathered to see. Ren Eagle Cruz did not crumble, they, 28 years old. Apache, which Dry Creek had made its business to notice before it noticed anything else about her. A face that stopped people mid-sentence without her trying, round and full and warm, cheekbones set high the way Apache women carried them, skin the color of sun-warmed copper, dark eyes with a stillness in them like a lake the moment before weather arrived. She was not sops, had never been small. Shoulders that belonged on someone who hauled things and lifted things and managed things without assistance. Hands too capable for any glove the general store carried. A body that moved through the world with the quiet confidence of something built to last rather than built to be admired. The town admired anyway, just not the way it should have. Vera Stanton stood on the porch of the Stanton Inn behind her, arms crossed, chin up in a completely different way, the way of a woman who had just won something and wanted everyone present to understand they'd witnessed it. 60 seconds ago, she had opened the front door and set Ren's suitcase out with the particular satisfaction of a person performing a civic duty they personally enjoyed. The words that came with it had carried the length of the street, because that was how Vera operated. Not a shout. Never a shout. A carrying voice. The voice of a woman who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of saying terrible things at exactly the volume required for maximum witnesses, and don't come back. We run a respectable establishment, which was how it always started. Respectable, as though the word was offense and Ren was on the wrong side of it by nature rather than circumstance. As though being thrown into the street was a verdict and not a cruelty. The crowd on the boardwalk was doing what crowds in small towns always did. Watching, calculating, deciding which way the wind was blowing before they committed to a direction. A man in a canvas apron stood outside the hardware store with his arms folded, the body language of someone who wanted to look uninvolved while his eyes gave him away entirely. A woman near the milliner's had drawn her daughter close, not protectively exactly, more the way you shield a child from something you haven't explained yet but plan to. Two men outside the barber shop were talking to each other but looking at Ren. Sheriff Frank Dole materialized from somewhere. That was the right word for it. Materialized. Because he hadn't been there a moment ago, and now he was, standing at a careful distance from the whole scene, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, face arranged into the expression of a man who considered himself a reasonable participant in an unreasonable situation. Ma'am, not unkind. Not kind either. Somewhere in the middle where inconvenience lived. You all right? Ren did not answer right away, because the question was not what it appeared to be. She had learned that about sheriffs, about towns, about the brand of concern that arrived after the damage was done, and functioned primarily as a warning dressed up as compassion. I'm fine. The words came out level. Mostly, best you move along then. Dole glanced toward Vera's porch. Not long. Just long enough to confirm whose side of the scale he was standing on. Town like this, folks talk. Once they're talking about somebody, there's not much a man in my position can do. I haven't done anything. That ain't what I heard. And there it was. That ain't what I heard. The founding sentence of every injustice she'd lived through in the past 4 months. Not I have evidence. Not I have proof. I heard. As though rumor was a legal instrument. As though the act of saying something loudly enough in the right company was indistinguishable from the act of it being true. 3 towns. 4 months. 3 different variations of this exact conversation, with 3 different sheriffs, and the same outcome every time. Ren Eaglecrest picking herself up off whatever ground she'd been deposited onto and walking until her feet bled through her stockings, and she found a 4th town that would take 4 weeks to begin the 3rd town all over again. She pressed her palms flat against the hot dirt and pushed herself up, because she was not doing this on her knees. She was a big woman. She had always been a big woman, and she had spent 28 years watching people decide what that meant before she opened her mouth. It meant slow. It meant simple. It meant the particular category of woman who was supposed to be grateful for what she got and quiet about what she didn't. Except none of those things were her. The gap between what people assumed and what she actually was had stopped feeling like an injustice sometime around town number 2 and started feeling like information about them. She stood. Dole had turned his back before she was fully upright. Conversation over, in his estimation. Then she heard the boots, not hurried. That was the thing. Every other pair of footsteps in the vicinity was either frozen or angled away, the shuffle of people repositioning themselves so they could claim later they hadn't been watching. These boots came straight, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who had already decided something and wasn't checking with the audience before following through. A shadow crossed the suitcase. Ren looked up, squinting against the white Texas sky, and found a man crouching down in front of her, not standing over her. Not approaching from the appropriate adult distance of someone performing a charitable act they planned to discuss as later. Crouching. Down on one knee in the dirt of the main street, at eye level, which was a thing nobody had done in a very long time. The shock of it hit her somewhere in the sternum before she had time to prepare for it. He was tall, the kind of tall you didn't fully appreciate until someone was next to him. Sun-browned and leather-vested, shirt sleeves pushed to his forearms, the hands of someone who fixed things and built things and didn't hire that work out to anyone else. A face that gave away nothing by accident. 36, maybe, with the kind of tired around the eyes that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with having carried something heavy for longer than was reasonable without putting it down. He looked at her, not at the spectacle of her, not at the category she represented, or the rumor circling her head, or the size of her, or the copper of her skin, or any of the other things the street had been cataloguing since she hit the ground. He looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve. You hurt? Flat. Not soft. Not the voice someone uses when they're performing concern for witnesses. Just a question, no. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. Liar and Ren Eaglecrest, who had not cried in front of anyone since Caldwell County, felt the back of her throat go tight in a way she was not prepared for. Not because he was kind. He hadn't been kind exactly. But because he had looked at her and seen that her feet were bleeding through her stockings and her hands were shaking and she'd been kneeling in the dirt for 10 minutes and none of that was fine. And he'd said so. The straightforwardness of it, the complete absence of pity, dressed up as manners, did something to her that all the cruelty of the last hour had failed to do. She did not cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in the street in front of Vera Stanton and Frank Dole and the entire assembled population of Dry Creek, Texas. He reached for the suitcase. She flinched. It was involuntary, the product of 4 months and returns and a specific education in what happened when men reached for things that's below her. She hated that it happened, hated that her body had learned that reflex without her permission. Something moved behind his eyes when he saw it. Something that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment and wasn't any of the reactions she expected there. And gone on a quarter second, "I'm not going to hurt you." He straightened up, suitcase in one hand, and offered her the other, not insisting, offering, the hand of someone who could wait indefinitely and intended to. "Just going to carry this, why?" "Because it's heavy and you've had a hard morning. That's all there is to it." "That's not what I meant. I know what you meant." A pause. "You want to stand in this street till Dole finds a reason to move you along, or you want to make a different choice?" Ren looked at his hand. She thought about what she'd learned about hands in the last 4 months. How hands that helped tended to come with conditions. How kindness that arrived publicly was often performance. How a man who stood between a woman and a crowd usually wanted something for it. She looked at his face. She couldn't read it, which was unusual. She had gotten very good at reading faces, and this one was giving her nothing except the fact that he had already decided something and was waiting for her to catch up. Rough. Calloused. Closed around hers with a steadiness that was not gentle exactly, but was something adjacent to it. Something like certainty. So she pulled herself up and for a moment they were standing close enough that she could see clearly that whatever he was thinking was not anything he planned to say in the street. "Vera." He raised his voice without turning around. "Whole town watching you throw a woman into the street is not the fine, upstanding performance you think it is." Vera's voice carried from the porch. "You know what she is, Reed Calloway. Everybody in this county knows by now, Reed Calloway. That was his name. I know what people are saying." He picked up Ren's suitcase and started walking. Haven't heard it from her own mouth, though. "Funny how that works. Don't say I didn't warn you. Wouldn't dream of it, Vera." And he walked. And because the alternative was standing in the street, watching him go until Dole found a legal pretext to make her situation worse, Ren walked with him. She was intensely aware of every eye on her back. She didn't turn around. The wagon was parked at the edge of the street, a working wagon, not fancy, with the practical wear of something used daily by someone who didn't have time to care about its appearance. Reed put her suitcase in the back and climbed to the seat, and she climbed up beside him without being helped a second time because she needed that, needed at least one thing she did today under her own power. He didn't speak. The wagon rolled out of town and he let the silence happen, hands loose on the reins. The town shrank behind them in that peculiar Tex way, where distance didn't make things smaller so much as it made them irrelevant. The land opened up, dry and vast and honest about it, golden brown grass baking under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Hills in the distance, blue-gray and shimmering. Beautiful for the way difficult things were sometimes beautiful. Unsentimental about what it cost to live nothing inside it. She finally spoke because the silence had gotten too full of things she was thinking. "You're not going to ask what they said about me. Why I keep getting run out of towns. What I didn't ask because I don't need to know today." He glanced sideways without turning his head. "Might ask someday, might not. Man who judges a woman on rumor isn't much of a man by my reckoning. That's a different book than most people in this county are reading. Most people's books are shorter than mine. Easier to read fast and get to the wrong ending." Ren almost smiled. She caught it before it happened because she wasn't sure she trusted it yet. But the pull was there, the involuntary recognition of something worth smiling at, and she had not had that in long enough that the feeling was slightly foreign. He drove. She watched the land instead of watching him, which helped, because watching the land didn't require her to be anything in particular. After a while he said, "Ranch is another 20 minutes out. Fair warning, it's not fancy. Roof leaks over the kitchen when the rain comes sideways. My son's room is a disaster on his best days. There's a spare room." He stopped, like a sentence that had run into something it didn't expect. "Hasn't been used since my wife passed. 3 years ago, Ren kept her eyes on the hills." "I'm sorry, everybody's sorry," said flat, not bitter. A man stating a fact he'd made peace with or was in the process of making peace with, which was not the same thing but looked similar from the outside. Doesn't fix the roof. Point is, the room's yours if you want it. Might feel like moving into somebody else's grief. Wanted to say that up front. "I know what that feels like," Ren said. "Moving into a space nobody wants you in." He looked at her then. A real look, not the sideways glance. something rearranging itself quietly behind his face. "Reckon you do," he said, and turned back to the road. They didn't speak again until the ranch appeared. Low house, wide porch. A barn leaning slightly to one side with the attitude of something that had decided to hold on because no one had told it not to. A corral where two horses stood in the heat with the philosophical patience of animals that had long since made their peace with Texas summers. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of place that made a person feel small walking up to it. After 4 months of feeling small everywhere she went, that quality alone was almost unbearable in its rarity. The boy came out of the barn before the wagon stopped, 9 years old. Moving fast, all energy in no particular direction yet, dust kicking up around bare feet. He went still the moment he saw the stranger on the seaside, his father. Children still had a version of that freeze that was entirely different from the adult version. Adults froze because they were calculating. Children froze because something had reorganized itself in their understanding of how the world worked and they needed a moment before proceeding. This boy, Danny Calloway. She would learn, though she didn't know it, yet looked at her with the complete, unfiltered attention of a child who had not yet learned that looking was something you were supposed to manage and moderate. "Pa, you said you'd be back before noon." "It's past." He stopped. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Wren." Reed climbed down. "She's going to be staying with us a while, helping around the house." Danny looked at her with the thorough inventory of a kid who had appointed himself the final authority on this decision. He took in her face, her hair, the copper of her skin, the size of her, the way she climbed down from the wagon without waiting for anyone to offer. "You're Apache," Reed's voice. "Danny, what?" "She is." Wren had her feet on the ground now, standing on her own, which mattered. "He's not wrong." Danny tilted his head, recalibrated slightly. "Ma says Apache women know how to talk to horses. Depends on the horse. Ours is mean. So am I. A beat. When I have to be." Danny stared at her. Then he turned to his father with the gravity of a 9-year-old delivering a ruling. "She can stay." Reed's face did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. "Glad we've got that settled." Wren carried her own suitcase inside. The house smelled like wood smoke and leather, and the dust of a home where nobody had time to chase it. The kitchen was small and competent. The shelves were half-stocked with the randomness of two people buying whatever they remembered and forgetting everything else. A single chipped plate sat in the basin like it had been waiting there for at least 2 days. Reed showed her the spare room, down the hall. Door that stuck slightly at the bottom, something the floorboard did in summer. The room was not empty exactly. It was full of someone else's presence in all the small ways a room retains a person after they're gone. A faint smell of lavender soap, a woman's shawl on the hook by the window, pale green, slightly faded. A hairbrush on the small table with a few strands caught in the bristles. A Bible on the nightstand with a pressed flower marking a page, something blue and small and careful. Brent did not touch any of it. "Take your time settling." Reed's voice from the doorway, one shoulder against the frame. "Nobody's going to bother you." "Reed," she stopped. Tried again. "Thank you. For not asking. For not looking at me the way everyone else does. Didn't do anything special." His hat came off and went back on, old habit. The gesture of a man who'd spent a long time tipping his hat at things. Just did what any decent person ought to. Suppers whenever the sun starts thinking about going down. "You're welcome to it whether you cook it or not. I'll cook it." "Figured you might say that." He left her alone. The door closed. The room held its silence. Wren sat down on the edge of the bed and let the quiet happen around her. Outside, Danny's voice carried through the wall, pitched at that frequency children use when they want to be heard but maintaining deniability about it. "Is she going to stay forever?" "Don't know. Smas still has mas things in it. I know it does." "Why'd you let her have it?" A pause, long enough that Wren's breath caught without her planning it. "Because a room sitting empty doesn't honor anybody, Danny. It just sits there collecting dust and grief. Your ma would have wanted somebody to need it. You think she needs it?" "That Apache lady," I think Reed said, slower, like a man finding his way through something without a map, that everybody needs somewhere to stand eventually. Today happened to be her turn. Wren pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, did not make a sound. She sat like that until the pressure behind her eyes became something she could breathe around. Then she unpacked the small amount she owned, changed her stockings because her feet needed something clean against them. splashed water on her face from the basin, and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen confirmed everything she'd already suspected about what two people feeding themselves without any particular enthusiasm or skill actually looked like. A cast iron pot with something crusted around the rim that defied identification. Half a sack of flour that had gotten damp at some point and dried wrong. Beans, at least a full bag, something to work with if you were willing to be patient about them. She found onions. She found a generous cache of bacon grease, which was a small miracle. She found weevils in the cornmeal and set that bag aside for later. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 4 minutes after she started working. Arm crossed, weight on one hip, the stance of a person conducting surveillance without bothering to pretend otherwise. "You're doing it wrong, am I?" She did not look up from the beans she was sorting. "Pa just dumps everything in the pot, and your pa's beans are what color, would you say?" A pause while Danny considered whether this was a trap. "Dark. They're not burnt, they're just dark. Dark is one word for it." She pushed a handful of good beans to one side and swept the questionable ones away. "Want to know another word for it?" Danny came closer despite himself. "What? Wrong?" He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table without being invited, which she noted and did not comment on, because it meant he was deciding to stay, which was a different thing entirely from being told to. By the time the sun started its slow conversation with the horizon, the smell coming out of the kitchen was the smell of something real. Bacon fat and onion going soft in the cast iron. Beans coaxed rather than bullied into cooperation. A pan of biscuits assembled from the salvaged flour, not remarkable biscuits, but biscuits, which was considerably better than what had been there before. Reed came in from the barn with dust on his shirt and the tiredness of someone who had been working since before the day officially started. He stopped in the doorway, just for a second. The way a person stops when something unexpected intersects with something they forgot they missed. That real food, it's eat beans, I've been eating beans. That doesn't smell like what I've been eating because you've been doing it wrong. She turned the biscuits. "Sit down." He sat. Danny was already at the table. The three of them ate in the way people eat when they're not yet sure what they are to each other, but the food is good enough to temporarily make the question irrelevant. No one talked about Vera Stanton. No one talked about Frank Dole or the street or the watching eyes or the 4 months Wren had spent being told in a variety of ways that she didn't belong anywhere. For 1 hour, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of someone else's life and now smelled of onion and bacon fat, she existed without being assessed. It was the strangest relief she had ever felt. Halfway through the meal, Danny hissed and pulled his hand back fast, tucking it against his chest, jaw locked in a way that was so thoroughly his father's expression that Wren recognized it before she registered the injury. "What happened?" "Nothing," tight-voiced. The voice of a child who has decided that needing help is a category of defeat. "Danny." Reed's voice, the parental register that left no room for negotiation. "It's just a splinter. From the barn this morning, let me see it." The boy held out his palm with the sigh of someone laying down a losing hand. The splinter sat deep below his thumb, the skin already reddening around it, puffy at the edges in a way that meant it had been in there a while, and was beginning to make its opinions known. Reed was already reaching for the shelf where the sewing kit lived. Wren was already standing. "I was a nurse for 6 years in a hospital that saw more infected wounds than most doctors manage in a lifetime. Let me look at his hand before you go jabbing a sewing needle into a boy who's already had a hard week." Reed paused with one hand on the shelf. Looked at her, not dismissive, not offended. Something closer to recalculation, the way an engineer looks at a bridge when someone with more relevant expertise shows up and says something worth listening to. "All right," he said. "Show me." She boiled water, cleaned the needle in the flame of the lamp until it glowed. Took Danny's small hand in hers with a gentleness that made the boy go still and watchful too. The way children go still when they realize someone knows exactly what they're doing. "This is going to hurt for about 2 seconds. She kept her voice even. "You can yell if you want. I won't think less of you. I don't yell, everybody yells the first time. It's not weakness, it's just what a body does when it's surprised." She worked the splinter free in one clean motion, quick, deliberate, the way she'd done it 100 times. Danny barely had time to flinch. She pressed the cloth to the small bead of blood that wallowed and held it without letting go. "There," she released his hand, Whole thing. Danny examined his palm with the critical eye of someone who'd been promised something dramatic. That's it. Didn't hurt that bad, told you. He was already going back to his beans. The way children abandoned a crisis, the moment it resolved, as though the last 5 minutes were a weather system that had passed. Reed had not moved from where he stood near the shelf. Needle still in his hand, expression doing something she couldn't fully pass. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated. Except the look of a man quietly revising a number of assumptions he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Where did you train? He asked it quietly, after Danny had redirected his full attention toward the biscuits. I didn't say, you're not going to. Not tonight. Not tonight. She met his eyes without looking away. You said you wouldn't ask questions. I did say that. He set the needle back in the sewing kit, sat down. Man's got to keep his word even when his curiosity is actively trying to ruin him, and Ren. For the second time in one evening, caught the pull of a smile before it could happen. Later, after Danny had been steered in the direction of his room with the particular combination of exhaustion and a reluctant 9-year-old's acceptance that's the long constituted a 9 good night, and after the kitchen had been set to rights and the fire banked, Ren lay in the room that still held the ghost of another woman's life and stared at the ceiling. She could hear Reed's footsteps somewhere in the house. Slow, deliberate. The sounds of a man doing the last things of a day with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been doing them alone long enough that they'd become ritual. Checking the locks, banking the fire. The small, repeated acts of a person who had learned that safety was not something you assumed but something you built, night after night, through the accumulation of small, careful acts. She thought about Vera Stanton's voice, cutting across the heat of the street. She thought about Frank Dole turning his back before she was upright. She thought about 3 towns. 3 sets of eyes that had clocked the Apache woman before they clocked anything else. 3 doors. 3 doors that had been evaluating whether to close us before she finished saying hello. 3 different sheriffs who all made the same calculation. The cost of helping her was higher than the cost of not. She did not let herself think about the other thing. The thing that had started all of this. The thing that lived in the letter folded inside her Bible, the proof that meant nothing to anyone who had already decided. Not tonight. Tonight she would allow herself exactly this much. A bed, a room, a door that closed. 2 people in this house who had looked at her and not made up their minds before looking. One of them had crouched down in the dirt of a public street, at her level, and called her a liar about her own pain, which was the strangest form of respect she'd been shown in longer than she could accurately recall. The footsteps in the hallway eventually stopped. Reed's door closed, and the night settled in around her thick with August heat and the distant sounds of something moving through the dry grass beyond the window. A coyote, maybe, or just the wind having an opinion. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she didn't cry either. Both of those things counted. Morning came hard and early. Ren was up before either of them, fire lit under the stove, flour on her hands, biscuits in progress by the time the sun had committed to being fully above the horizon. Danny materialized in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes with his fists, a sleep habit that would probably follow him into adulthood whether he wanted it to or not. He stopped, stared at the table with the expression of a person whose understanding of the morning had been reorganized without his consent. What? That eggs, biscuits. Sit down and eat both before you go outside. Pa lets me skip breakfast sometimes. Your pa also thinks dark beans count as a seasoning. I wouldn't be quoting him as a nutritional authority. Danny's mouth twitched, fought it, lost the fight slightly and then recovered. He sat down anyway and picked up a biscuit and bit into it before his pride could lodge a formal objection. The sound he made was involuntary and entirely honest. These are better than pa's. Your pa's biscuits could double as building materials, so don't tell him I said that. I'll take it to my grave. Reed came through the back door a few minutes later, hat already on, the efficiency of a man who had been awake and working for at least an hour. He stopped in the doorway the same way Danny had, taking in the table, the smell, the boy actually eating voluntarily before being threatened into it. What did you do to him? Fed him something that wasn't dark. I'll have you know my biscuits have character. They have the structural integrity of a clay brick is what they have. Danny laughed. An actual laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind a child makes when they've stopped calculating whether laughter is appropriate and just let it happen. Reed went still for a half-second when he heard it. The way a person goes still when they hear something they forgot was possible. He was cataloguing it, she realized, filing it somewhere for later access. And she noted the way this man watched his son with the particular hunger of someone who had been worried for longer than he should have had to be, about whether the boy was going to be okay. Eat fast. Reed sat across from her. Fences down on the north pasture. Need to get new wire strung before the cattle find the gap and vote to become someone else's problem. I'll help. He looked up from his coffee. You ever strung fence wire? No, I've set broken bones. And I've worked with surgeons in field conditions where there was time to wait for anyone with more authority to arrive. I expect I can manage wire. The table went quiet. Danny had put his biscuit down and was staring at her with wide eyes that had entirely forgotten to be strategic. Reed set his coffee cup down. Slowly. You did that, she had realized half a sentence ago what she'd let out. She turned back to the stove and busied herself with the pan in a way that was slightly too deliberate to be casual. I told you I was a nurse. You said hospital work it was. Sometimes the hospital was a tent. That sounds like. He stopped. I'm not ready to talk about the rest of it. She did not turn around. I told you that already. A pause. The pause of a man deciding whether to press and choosing, instead, to respect what was in front of him. She heard his chair push back. Wire won't string itself. And then after a beat, you coming or not? The fence work was brutal in the way honest physical labor is brutal when you're not accustomed to the muscles it uses. Wire that had opinions. Posts that required more force than it seemed geometrically possible. Sun that had decided the morning pleasantries were over. But there was something in it she hadn't expected, a quality entirely different from the exhaustion of being watched and evaluated and found in violation of something she'd never agreed to. The fence did not care who she was. The wire did not adjust its resistance based on her bloodline. The posts went in when she put sufficient effort behind them and stayed up when she set them properly. And there was an honesty as transaction she had been starving for without knowing what she was missing. You're so stronger than you're letting on. Reed, watching her haul a post upright without asking for help. People assume big means slow. I've spent my whole life proving otherwise. She drove the post into the ground with more force than strictly required. One fence post at a time if I have to. Didn't assume anything. Just calling what I see. Simple. Accurate. Without flattery. She filed it next to other things he'd said that landed differently than she expected. The horse complicated things. A young gelding, green and unsettled, spooked by something that might have been a snake in the grass, or might have been the accumulated restlessness of an animal cooped up too long with too much energy and not enough to do with it. It reared hard. The lead rope snapped. It came down in a wheeling panic, and Danny was directly in its path, frozen the way children freeze when the world turns dangerous without warning. Danny Reed's voice cracked across the field. He was 30 yards out. The horse was 3 feet from his son and closing. Wren did not think. She stepped between the animal and the boy, arms low and open. Voice dropped into the register she'd spent years developing, low, steady, without edges. The voice that said the center was held and the frightened thing could find it if it was looking. Easy, not loud, not commanding. Something else entirely. Nobody's hurting you. Easy now. The horse's ears flicked toward her. She kept her body loose. Every instinct trained over years of working with people in pain said the same thing it said to a frightened animal. Panic feeds on panic. The moment you flinch, you give it something to run toward. So you don't flinch. You hold the center. You make the center so steady that the frightened thing can find its way there. The gelding's wild rolling eye found her face. It slowed, its sides heaved. It stamped and blew hard through its nose and stood, trembling, close enough that she could have reached out and touched it. She didn't. She just kept talking, low and even, until she felt Reed come up behind and the moment the rope was back in his hands. Only then did her own hands start shaking. Danny hit her around the waist like he'd been launched. Small arms locking with the grip of a child who had been very scared for 45 seconds and was channeling all of it into a hug that communicated multiple things simultaneously. You stopped him, muffled against her side. You just stopped him. I learned a long time ago that panic feeds on panic. She got one hand on the back of his head, steadying herself as much as him. Best thing you can do for something scared is refuse to be scared back at it. How do you know how to do that? Same place I learned everything else I don't talk about. She let out a breath. Fear doesn't care if it's got 2 legs or 4. Talks slow. Stay low. Don't flinch. Works on frightened animals and frightened men both. In my experience, Reed was standing with the gelding's rope in his hand, the horse calm now and slightly embarrassed about the episode, and he was looking at her over Danny's head with an expression that had traveled past gratitude somewhere in the last 90 seconds and arrived somewhere she wasn't ready to name. You saying I'm a frightened animal, Miss Wren. I'm saying you flinch less than most, which is a compliment. Don't ruin it by arguing. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition of something he'd been noticing piece by piece and was finally adding up. You keep doing things like that, he said. Folks in town are going to have to find something new to gossip about. Folks in town would find a way to make gravity sound suspicious. He didn't disagree. The supply run into Dry Creek came 2 days later, and Wren felt the dread of it building from the moment she knew it was coming. A cold knot low in her stomach that no amount of morning work could dissolve. You don't have to come, Reed. Reading her the way he had apparently decided was his right, without announcement or apology. I can get what we need. You'll forget the thread. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Same as you forgot it the last 2 times. I forgot it once. I checked the supplies when I arrived. There is no thread in that house. You've forgotten it at minimum 3 times. Danny's wagon bed, perfectly timed. He told Earl he just didn't feel like buying it. I pay your wages, Reed told him. You don't pay me anything. I'm your son, I feed you, which is the same thing. The exchange did something to the cold knot in her stomach. Not dissolved it, made it smaller, more manageable, possible to carry without it defining the whole morning. But it came back. The moment the wagon rolled onto Fan Street and every face on the boardwalk turned toward them with the synchronization of people who had been waiting and didn't want to admit it. Holt's store. The bell above the door announced them. The man behind the counter, Holt 50s, with the nervous precision of someone who had built his livelihood on not offending the right people, looked up, looked at Wren, looked at the list she set on the counter, and did not reach for it. Low on most of that, his shelves were full. Floor to ceiling, she knew this moment, had lived this exact moment in 3 different versions. She knew what she'd done before the way her voice had dropped as something careful and placating, the instinct to make herself smaller in hopes that smallness was less threatening, the wearing process of trying to earn the right to be sold to. She opened her mouth. Reed's hand came down flat on the counter. Not loud, not violent, just final. The sound of something settled rather than something begun, Holt. I've bought feed and seed off you for 6 years. Never been short on credit. Never run a bill past 30 days. You going to tell me right now in front of God and everyone watching that my account's no good because of who's standing next to me? Holt's jaw worked. His eyes went to the window, making a calculation about who he was more afraid of disappointing. Ain't about the money, Reed. Then tell me what it's about. Folks talk. Folks also talk. You've been selling to every one of them their whole lives. The voice didn't rise. The thing underneath it went harder. You going to sell what's on that list, or am I taking 6 years of business across the street to Briggs and telling every rancher I know to do the same? The list was retrieved with hands that were not entirely steady. Didn't mean anything by it, Holt said to his own counter. Course not, Reed replied, and did not put any effort into making it sound like he believed that. They were halfway back to the wagon, arms loaded, when Vera Stanton stepped off the boardwalk and into their path, planted, arms crossed. The pose of a woman who had choreographed this moment, Reed Calloway. Her voice had that, carrying precision again, aimed not at Reed, but at the street, at the witnesses, at the audience that had remained, and the ones who had filtered back out of shops at exactly the right moment. You know what I heard from a woman over in Caldwell County just last week. Don't much care what you heard, Vera. You will. Her eyes moved past Reed, straight to Wren. Heard there was a baby died under her care. Family blamed her. Said there was money missing after. Medicine money? A pause, waited with intent. That why you keep running, girl? That why no town wants you around long enough to put down roots? The street went quiet, the way streets go quiet when everyone has stopped pretending they weren't listening. Wren felt the words land, each one separately, because she'd heard versions of them before and they never landed the same way twice. The baby, always the baby first. And then the money, which was a lie built on top of a tragedy, the two woven so tightly you couldn't pull one thread without the other following. Her knees did not buckle. She would not allow her knees to buckle in front of Vera Stanton. But her voice, which she needed, which was the only thing she had to work with, that was not available. The words she wanted existed clearly somewhere behind her sternum, and the distance between there and her mouth had become a distance she could not cross with the whole street watching. She stood there, mouth open, no sound, exactly as Vera wanted. That is enough, Reed's voice. The edge she had not heard before, not loud, controlled, but carrying a quality of danger more convincing than shouting. He stepped forward, between Vera and Wren. Deliberate and physical, a man placing himself precisely where a line needed to exist. You've got a grievance with her, you take it up with her privately. You don't get to stand in the middle of the street and gut a woman open for the town's entertainment. I'm just telling the truth. You're telling rumor dressed up as truth because you enjoy the way it sounds when you say it out loud, his jaw set. Whatever happened to her, it's hers to tell when she's ready, to who she chooses, not yours to put up for auction in public. You don't know what she is. I know what I've seen. He did not step back. I've seen her stop spooked horse ass that would have run down my son. I've seen her take a splinter out of Danny's hand gentler than I could have managed. I've seen her put 2 meals on the table in that house that tasted like somebody actually cared whether the people eating them were all right. The pause was precise. That's considerably more than you've shown me in 6 years of knowing you, Vera. Vera's mouth opened, closed, faltered, opened again, looking for something that could compete with what had just been said in front of the same witnesses she'd been performing for, and finding nothing. She turned, skirt cracking with the fury of a woman who had lost an audience she considered rightfully hers, back to the inn. With that, another that breathed. Wren was shaking. Not visibly, she thought, but Reed's hand found her elbow steady and immediate, guiding her toward the wagon before her legs had fully rejoined the conversation. You didn't have to do that, she said, when they were clear of the worst of it. Yeah, he set the supplies in the back of the wagon, climbed up. I did. They were clear of town, the road opening up ahead of them before Wren spoke again. If they find what they're looking for in Austin, she said, not looking at him, watching the grass on either side of the road instead, I'm not going to let you stand between me and the law. That's not fair to you or Danny. Reed held the reins loose, let the silence sit for a moment. Didn't ask for fair, asked for honest. You going to tell me what they're looking for? Not today, all right, Reed. She turned, looked at him directly. I need you to understand something. I'm not going to just wait for whatever's coming. I'm going to fight it. But I need to know if you're the kind of man who can let a woman fight her own battles while standing close enough to catch her if she falls. He glanced at her sideways, the same look he'd given her on the wagon ride out of town the first day. Something reconsidering without making a production of it. I reckon I can manage that, he said. Good. She looked back at the road, because I'm going to need it. Neither of them spoke again until the ranch came into view, and the silence on that ride back was different from the silence on the first ride out. Fuller, less cautious. The silence of two people who had started, without announcing it, to learn the shape of each other. Inside the house, the kitchen waited. The spare room waited. The Bible on the nightstand with the letter inside it waited. What she did not know, what she couldn't have known, was that Vera Stanton had already done it again. The letter had gone out from Dry Creek that same afternoon, while they were still in the store arguing about thread. Ink dry by the time the wagon rolled back to Callaway Flats. Headed to Austin with a specific name on it. Asking about a specific Apache woman who called herself Eaglecrest but whom a family in Caldwell County would very much like an accounting from regarding a warrant that bore her other name. Wren didn't know this yet, for tonight, in the spare room of a man who had told a town to mind its own business and meant it, that particular ignorance was the only mercy available, and she took it, and she let her eyes close, and she allowed herself to believe that morning might be something other than another door getting ready to close. She was wrong about some of that, but she was not wrong about the morning. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 minutes before anyone touched it again. Reed had set it down after reading the name on the front. Not thrown it, not slid it away, just set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he wasn't sure was safe. The kitchen held the smell of that morning's coffee and the remains of breakfast, and the envelope sat in the middle of it all looking completely ordinary, which was the worst part. It looked like every other piece of mail, brown paper, neat handwriting, addressed to Wren Aldcott, care of Dry Creek, Texas, a name she hadn't used in 4 months, a name she'd been trying to leave in Caldwell County where it belonged. Wren stared at it from across the table. Her hands were still floury from the biscuit dough she'd been working when Reed came in from the mail run. The flour had dried slightly at her knuckles. She noticed it with the strange clarity that arrived when the brain decided the small physical details of a moment were safer to process than the large, catastrophic ones. Aldcott. Reed's voice was careful. That means something to you, everything. It means everything and none of it good. But she sat down first, because this was a conversation that needed a chair under it, she told him. Not the compressed version she'd been telling herself for 4 months, the one that started in the middle and had left out to aid her, the parts that made her look like someone who had loved the wrong people and trusted the wrong family and believed that being useful was the same as being safe. She told him the whole of it, from the beginning, the way it actually happened. Her husband's name was James Aldcott. She had married him at 24, which seemed young now, and had seemed reasonable then because he was steady and quiet, and the kind of man who showed up to things which she had mistaken for character. James had a sister named Clara Harwick. Clara had a son 8 years old named Thomas, and Thomas had gotten sick in the February of the previous year with a fever that came on fast and did not behave the way fevers were supposed to behave when you did the right things for them. She had been called in, not by a stranger, by family, because she was the only trained nurse in 3 counties, and she was Thomas's aunt by marriage, and they trusted her the way you trust people who are supposed to be yours. She had gone. She had done everything she knew. The protocols, the cooling, the hydration she forced in small amounts when he couldn't keep anything down. The quinine she bought with her own money on the second day when the family's supply ran out, and she rode 2 hours in the wrong direction to find more because the nearest town that had it was not the nearest town. She sat beside that bed for 71 hours, sleeping in the chair when she slept at all, and she had watched Thomas Harwick fight the fever, and she had done everything that medicine could do, and on the 3rd night it was not enough. Thomas died at 2 in the morning with his mother holding one hand and Wren working over him with both of hers. Clara's scream when it happened was the sound Wren still heard sometimes at the edge of sleep. Not a cry, a scream, the specific animal sound of a mother's understanding arriving at a thing it would never accept. And then the grief needed somewhere to go. Grief always did. And Wren was right there, present and available, the person whose hands had been over Thomas when he stopped breathing, the person who had been in charge of the thing that went wrong. It didn't matter that she hadn't been in charge of his immune system or the particular way his small body had decided it couldn't sustain the fight. She had been there. She had been the nurse. She had been the person who was supposed to fix it. So she became the person who hadn't. James had left us during the week of the funeral, not loudly, not in anger or not primarily in anger. He came to her and said he couldn't look at her without seeing Thomas's faces, and he thought it was better if he went, as though his inability to manage his own grief was a reason to abandon hers, as though what was happening to her right now, in front of his eyes, was a secondary consideration to the discomfort of being in the same room with someone who reminded him of loss. She had not argued. She was too tired to argue. And somewhere under the tired she was not sure she wanted him to stay, which told her things about the marriage she hadn't been ready to examine. Clara filed the warrant 2 weeks after the funeral. Negligence causing death. A judge in Austin signed it without requesting a single piece of medical documentation, without contacting the attending physician who had been present, without asking to see Wren's notes or dosage records or the letter the doctor had written in the first week after Thomas died. The letter that stated clearly and without ambiguity that the fever had been beyond intervention by the time any nurse was called, that everything done had been correct, that the outcome was illness and not error. The judge had not asked for any of that, because Clara Harwick's family was old money in Austin. and grief-wearing old money's face did not get asked to produce evidence before receiving what it wanted. So Wren ran, not because she was guilty. Because the first sheriff she'd tried to stay and fight with had already written to Austin, before she'd unpacked had already said that a $10 a bar reward was more valuable than whatever she had to say in her own defense. She learned fast that showing proof to the wrong person just told them exactly what to sell, and to whom. She had a doctor's letter in her Bible since the day she left Ish. She set it on the table now, unfolded it, slid it across to read. He read it the way he read everything slowly, with the attention of someone who understood that words on paper meant exactly what they said, and not what he hoped they said. When he finished, he sat back. The muscle in his jaw worked once. This doctor says the boy's fever had already turned before you were called in. Yes, says you spent your own money on medicine when the family ran out. I didn't think about the money, direct. Without apology, I thought about Thomas. Something passed through Reed's expression, quick and then gone, but she caught it the way she'd been catching things about him since the beginning. Then why would any judge sign a warrant against you without looking at this? Because a warrant doesn't need truth. The words came out harder than she intended, the hardness of a fact learned through damage. It needs someone grieving enough to demand one, and a judge who'd rather sign than say no to a respected family. Reed folded the letter back along its existing creases, careful, and slid it back across to her. Then we find a judge who isn't afraid of respected families. You make it sound simple. Never said simple, said possible. Those are different things. His hand moved across the table, stopped just short of hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without contact. I have a friend in Fort Worth, Owen Pruitt. We served together. Man is a lawyer now, and he owes me a favor considerably larger than this, Reed. She stopped, started again. You don't have to. Stop telling me what I don't have to do. Not unkind, but with no room in it. I decided what I was willing to do the day I crouched down in front of you in that street. Everything since then has just been following through on it. She had no answer for that, which was unusual, because she generally had an answer for everything. She picked up the letter and returned it into its place in the Bible, carried it back to her room, and stood for a moment in the doorway looking at the room that still held a dead woman's shawl on the hook, and thought about what it meant to be in a place where someone was willing to fight for her before she'd even asked. She hadn't decided yet if it was safe to believe it, but she was no longer certain it wasn't. Reed wrote to Pruitt that evening at the kitchen table, by lamplight, with the careful deliberateness of a man who chose his words rather than produced them. Wren worked at the counter and did not read over his shoulder, though she was aware of every scratch of the pen, every pause. Danny had been put to bed, and the house had contracted to its nighttime dimensions, smaller and closer, the intimacy of shared lamplight that arrived when a day's worth of distance fell away. She knew she should go to her room. She was still standing at the counter 20 minutes later. You should sleep, Reed, without looking up from the letter. You should finish writing. I can write with you standing there. I can sleep when the letter's done. Done, he said.
The pen down.
Looked at her across the kitchen the way he had of looking at things when he decided to actually see them. You don't trust it yet, she considered lying. Decided against it. No, that's fair. He picked the pen back up. I wouldn't either. In your position, which was the correct answer, which was not the answer most people gave. Because most people wanted to be trusted and took untrustworthiness as a commentary on their character, rather than a reasonable response to accumulated evidence. Reed Calloway apparently did not require her to pretend that 4 months of being sold out hadn't taught her anything. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the kind she'd brought with her to this house. Quieter. It had less weight in it. The rock came through the kitchen window on a Wednesday night, 14 days after Wren arrived at Calloway Flats. No warning, no preceding sounds. Just the routine sounds of supper being cleared, Danny still at the table with the last of his biscuit, and then the explosion of glass and the rock skidding hard across the floorboards, coming to rest against the length of the table to Danny's, close enough to Danny's foot that he blinked at it for a full second before the noise registered. His elbow hit his cup. Water everywhere. Wren had Danny by the shoulders and pulled back from the glass before she'd fully registered doing it, the nurse's instinct kicking in ahead of the thinking brain. Clear the person from the hazard first. Assess second. Reed was out the back door. Echo the breaking glass had finished. She heard his boots on the porch, heard the dark silence that answered his scan of the yard, heard the diminishing sound of hooves somewhere beyond them bowing fast toward the road. Gone before he'd gotten outside. Planned that way, he came back with the rock. Wrapped around it, a piece of paper held in place with a strip of rawhide. He unwrapped it at the table, one hand flattening the note against the wood. The handwriting was uneven and deliberate at once, the quality of someone writing with their non-dominant hand, or someone who rarely wrote at all. Send her back or lose more than a window, Danny read it. Because Danny was 9 and 9-year-olds read things that landed in front of them, that was just the nature of 9, his voice very small. Who did that? Don't know yet. Reed folded the paper, put it in his shirt pocket. The line of his jaw had gone to something Wren hadn't seen before, not the steady control of the man who'd faced Vera in the street, but something underneath that, older and less managed. But I intend to find out. It's because of me, Wren said it flat. Because it was flat. A fact, not a complaint. They want me gone. And I should. No, Reed, I've done this before. I've watched what happens when a town decides. I said no. He turned to face her fully, and the thing under his jaw was still there, but his voice was precise, not loud, with a quality that told her this was the last syllable on the subject. I'm not running a woman off my own land because a coward's too afraid to show his face in daylight. They could escalate. Cowards escalate to the level required to scare someone. The moment it's clear it's not working, they stop. He crouched down to Danny's level, voice shifting register immediately. You all right, son? Danny's hands had been wrapped around the edge of the table. They loosened slightly at his father's voice. A nod. Nobody is sending Miss Wren anywhere, said clearly. Clearly enough to carry through the broken window and out into whatever dark corner Thanard who'd thrown that rock had retreated to. Not tonight. Not any night. This is her home, same as it's ours. Anybody with a problem about that can come say it to my face instead of hiding behind a rock in the dark. Wren pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Not because she was hurt. Because something that had been braced against impact for 4 months had just been told by someone she was starting to believe meant it, that it didn't have to stay braced right now. They boarded the window that night with scrap wood from the barn. Hot work in the dark, Reed holding the light, Wren handing wood at the angles he needed without being asked, the two of them developing the wordless efficiency of people who had started to understand how the other person moved. Danny had been sent to bed over his strenuous objection and remained there, though sleep was not happening on his end of the house. Won't keep weather out for long, Reed said, stepping back to consider the patched window. It'll do until you can get glass. I'm going back into town for it this week. She looked at him. After tonight, especially after tonight. Man who retreats from a threat just proves the threat worked. The lamp threw his face into uneven angles. Whoever threw that rock is about to learn they picked the wrong ranch, and because she believed him, which was still slightly startling as a condition of being alive, she went inside. 3 nights later, she heard Danny crying through the wall. Not the loud crying of a child who expects to be heard. The muffled, careful kind, the kind a child develops after deciding that needing comfort makes them a burden. She had heard that sound in hospital wards from patients trying to be polite about their pain, and she had always hated it, because it was a sound no child should ever have learned to produce. She didn't knock. She opened the door softly and sat on the edge of the bed without being invited. Because children who had learned to cry quietly had usually also learned to say they were fine when asked. Danny had his knees pulled up, moonlight laying a pale stripe across the quilt. Bad dream, he said. Not a question. Preemptive about your ma? A pause longer than a no should have been, then a small nod. You want to tell me, or you want me to just sit here until it passes? The breath he let out was not steady. Just sit, so she sat, one hand resting light on his back, not speaking. Outside, the August dark pressed against the window, and the coyote that lived somewhere past the north ridge called once and went quiet, and after a while Danny's breathing evened out the way breathing does when the worst of something has moved through. She used to sing, so quiet she almost missed it, when I couldn't sleep. Pa doesn't sing. He just sits there real stiff, like he's scared if he moves, he'll break something. Grief does that to people, makes them afraid of their own softness, a beat. Then Danny. with the unflinching directness of a child asking what they actually wanted to know. Are you scared of yours? The question found something she hadn't been expecting it to find. The honest answer was yes. Softness had been the thing that kept getting her hurt. Caring about Thomas Hartwick's fever had cost her a husband and 3 towns and a federal warrant. Letting herself believe James's family was her family had given them the angle they needed. Softness was the thing she'd been managing carefully ever since, keeping it on a short leash, not letting it run ahead of her. Sometimes, she said, softness gets you hurt in the places I've been. People take kindness and use it against you, not here, absolute. The way children were absolute about the things they'd decided. Pa wouldn't let anybody hurt you here. She looked at the window, at the orange moon hanging heavy over the dry hills, at the quality of the dark between here and the horizon, which was very different from the dark she'd been living in. I hope you're right, she said. And she meant it more than she had meant anything in longer than she could calculate. Frank Dole arrived at the ranch the following morning with the energy of a man who had ridden at some pace he was now regretting. His horse had been pushed. Dole himself had the look of someone who had woken up with a task he didn't want and had decided to complete it before he could talk himself out of it. Reed met him in the yard. Wren watched from the kitchen window. Dole had a wire from Austin. Somebody in Caldwell County was making inquiries about a woman matching a specific description Apache, traveling alone, going by Eagle Crest or Old Cot. The Harwick family had engaged someone to track the warrant down and enforce it. A man named Cord was being discussed. A federal marshal. Federal, the word landed in her chest like a stone drop from a height. Reed's response was not raised voices. She couldn't hear the words from the window, but she knew the posture, the set of his shoulders. The stance of a man who was not moving and had no intention of moving. When Dole left, she came out to the porch. He's already taken the money. Reed looked at her. Probably. Then we don't have much time, she said it, without the fear she'd expected to feel. Not because she wasn't afraid she was, acutely, but because the fear had a shape now, and shaped things could be dealt with. I need to get to Fort Worth before Cord does. Not a letter to Pruitt. I need to be in that office in person with the doctor's letter in my hand while someone with legal authority is reading it. That's 2 days hard ride. I know. Marshall could arrive while we're gone. That's why Earl needs to stay with Danny. And Danny needs to go to a neighbor family until we're back. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to fix this for me, Reed. I'm asking you to ride with me while I fix it myself. He studied her for a moment, not weighing whether he trusted her judgment. Understanding it, which was different. We leave at first light, he said. Telling Earl was its own exercise. The old man listened with the complete skepticism of someone who had seen enough plans go sideways to have developed opinions about optim as a general philosophy. He spat once into the dirt before answering, You're leaving me alone out here with a federal marshal potentially inbound. You'll have a locked gate and enough stubbornness to slow down a congressional inquiry. Reed's mouth carried the slight quality of someone controlling the urge toward amusement. You've held harder situations together with less. I held those situations because I didn't have a 9-year-old asking questions the whole time. Danny's going to the Fielding place. Not the Fieldings. Tommy Fielding threw that rock through this window. We don't know that for certain. I know it with the certainty of a man who has watched Tommy Fielding for 9 years. Earl squinted at the boarded window with the expression of a man whose certainties had been confirmed. Send the boy to the Harpers. The Harpers it is. Earl looked at Wren. Held the look longer than he usually did, which for Earl was notable, because Earl looked at things only as long as he needed to, and not a second past useful. You worth the trouble, Miss Wren. She blinked. Because I wouldn't be helping otherwise. He turned back toward the barn. Just so you know. She filed that on alongside the other things that had happened since she arrived at this ranch that she hadn't known how to prepare for. Telling Danny was harder. He stood in the yard with his arms crossed in the configuration that meant he had preloaded several arguments in case the first one didn't land. The set of his jaw was his father's jaw, had been since the beginning. You're coming back, not a question, a declaration of something he had decided was a fact. Both of us, Reed said. Together, Searle says marshals don't always give folks a fair shake. Earl talks too much. He says Pete Harper's brother sat in jail 3 months over a horse he didn't steal. Danny. Pete Harper's brother is a different situation. How Reed started to answer. Wren crouched down, not because Danny was short, but because the level look. We have proof. A letter from the doctor who was there, written before anyone had a reason to lie. A judge who reads that letter and the law together will have to let me go. What if the judge doesn't read it? Then we find another judge. What if Danny, quiet, firm? I've spent 4 months running. I'm done running. I'm going to Fort Worth to stand in front of someone with authority and make them look at the truth. That is not the same as losing. Do you understand me? The chin wobbled briefly. Then it set again. You better fight hard. I intend to. He threw his arms around her neck with the force of someone who had made a decision about the correct level of feeling to commit to and had committed fully. She held on. For a moment that stretched. Then he pulled back with all his reconstructed dignity and said, "Hurry back, as fast as we can ride," Reed promised, and they left. The first day's ride was hard in the way that Texas in August was always hard relentlessly and without apology. They pushed the horses at the pace of people who understood that time was a variable in an equation they hadn't solved yet. The land burned and flattened and burned again, and the sky above it was the deep, unforgiving blue of something heated through. She told him about the hospital, not because he asked, but because they were riding, and the rhythm of the horses, and the open land, and the fact that his eyes were on the road ahead rather than on her face made it feel possible to say things she hadn't said out loud since she'd left to Caldwell County. She told him about the field conditions, about the year she'd worked a hospital tent after a bad winter when the regular county facilities were overwhelmed, about the things she'd learned to do that no nursing school covered, but because nursing schools prepared you for rooms with adequate light and clean instruments, and the ability to wait for the doctor to arrive. She told him about the men she'd sat with until they weren't in the world anymore, and the ones she'd kept in the world longer than anyone expected, and the particular education of learning that you get everything right and lose anyway, and that doing everything right still mattered, was still the thing you did, because the alternative was doing things wrong and losing faster. Reed listened. He asked one question. At the end, after a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it. Do you miss it? She thought about that honestly. I miss the certainty of knowing what to do with my hands. I don't miss knowing it wasn't going to be enough every third time. He nodded, like that was an answer he'd recognize from something in his own experience, though he didn't say what. They camped the first night beside a creek that had more sand than water left in it by August, but was still wet enough to matter. The fire was small and practical. The dark out here was a different caliber of dark than town dark, the stars overhead deployed with the extravagance of a sky that had no competition. Wren was not asleep. She heard him shift on his side of the fire. You're not sleeping, neither are you. I'm thinking about tomorrow. So am I. A beat. Then, what are you actually thinking about? What she was thinking about was the letter. Whether Pruitt could move fast enough. Whether a Fort Worth judge would look at what I had and see what it said or see what was convenient. Whether the Harwick family's money had arrived ahead of her. What she said was,
Marshall Cord.
Reed turned his head toward her, the firelight reading his face sideways. Cord's not the problem if we get Pruitt moving fast enough, and if Pruitt can't move fast enough, then we deal with what's in front of us when it arrives. He shifted slightly closer to the fire, closer to her. Come sit closer. This wind is cold for August, she moved, not all the way to his shoulder, but close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him separately from the fire, and she let herself register that without immediately building a wall around it. 90 days from now, he said, his voice lower now, without the careful management he usually applied to things he meant, when there's no warrant left between us, I intend to ask you something. I want you to answer it from a place of wanting, not from a place of owing. The fire shifted. A small collapse of ash. What if I already know what my answer would be? Then I'd say wait anyway. A pause that was not empty. Because you deserve to make that choice without anything pushing you toward it except the choice itself. Not fear. Not gratitude. Not any of the things that look like wanting but are really just survival. She looked at the stars for a long moment. You're an unusual man, Reed Calloway, so I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. I know you do. The fire settled again. Sleep, Wren. Tomorrow needs you sharp. She didn't sleep immediately, but the sleeplessness that followed was quieter than anything she'd carried into this trip. It had room in it for something other than dread. Fort Worth arrived in the mid-afternoon of the second day, loud and purposeful and layered, the kind of noise Dry Creek never generated even on its busiest day. They dowed the main street with the compression that happened when two people had been in open country for 2 days and suddenly had to navigate something with horses. Pruett's are closed. A handwritten sign, slightly crooked on the door nail. Out of town. Return Thursday. Thursday was 3 days away. Wren looked at the sign, felt the thing that wanted to rise in her chest and named it precisely. Not defeat. Not despair. A specific frustration that arrived when the plan encountered reality without warning. She named it, filed it, set it aside. Courthouse, she said. Wren, if the circuit judge is sitting this week, there's a chance we can file for an emergency review without Pruett. It's a longer shot, but 3 days is 3 days, and Cord could already be at the ranch. She turned her horse toward the county building. I'm not waiting, Reed followed without another word. The courthouse clerk was 20-something with ink on 3 fingers and the wary look of a person who had been managing other people's urgency all day. He started his objection before she'd finished her sentence. Judge Waverley was in session, not seeing visitors, appointments through the end of the week. Wren was already past his desk, not running, but moving with the velocity of a woman who had decided that whatever was on the other side of the door was worth the professional consequences of walking through it without permission. Startled bailiff opened his mouth. Reed, 2 steps behind her, did something with his expression that the bailiff apparently decided was sufficient reason to let this particular situation develop without his intervention. Owen Pruett walked out of a side door with files under his arm and the face of a man whose day had already been longer than he'd signed up for. He saw Reed stopped. Calloway, taking in the dust and the urgency they were both carrying. This better be exactly as serious as you look. Farshall's coming for her, Reed, without preamble. Could be days, could be less. We need that doctor's letter in front of a judge before he shows up or nothing else matters. Something reorganized itself in Pruett's face. The irritation of the interrupted man gave way to the focused attention of someone who recognized a solvable problem and had already started solving it. My office, both of you. Tell me everything and do not leave anything out because judges notice gaps faster than they notice lies. His office was on the 3rd floor, and he listened the way good lawyers listened, without the expressions of sympathy or shock that told you someone was performing their engagement rather than actually paying attention. He asked questions when he needed to, direct, targeted, the kind that went straight to the thing that could be argued or couldn't. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, you never billed the Harwick family for the medicine you purchased yourself. I didn't think about billing them straight. No hesitation. I thought about Thomas. Pruett closed his file. I can file for an emergency review with Judge Waverley. It won't dismiss the warrant outright, but it will suspend enforcement pending a proper hearing. That buys you time instead of hours, which is the difference between a fight you can win and a situation you're managing from inside a jail cell. What if Waverley says no? Pruett's expression was the expression of a man who had spent enough years in courthouse hallways to have a specific relationship with that question. Then we find a judge who says yes. I didn't choose this profession because judges are consistently reasonable. I chose it because with enough persistence they occasionally are. The filing took the better part of a day. Pruett moved with the efficiency of someone who knew where bureaucracy had weak points because he'd spent years locating them. They waited in the courthouse hallway on a bench polished by the waiting of 1,000 other people, and Wren watched the light move across the opposite wall as the hours turned, and Reed sat beside her without offering false optimism, which was the kindest thing he could have done. She was aware of his shoulder, the inch of space between his arm and hers. How deliberately neither of them was closing it. She was also aware that she was thinking about that at all, which was notable, because for 4 months the only thing her mind had had room for was the warrant and the running, and whether the next town was going to become the 3rd town all over again. Something had changed. She knew when it had changed. She just hadn't named it yet, because naming things made them real and real things could be lost. Pruett reappeared at 4 in the afternoon holding a document, his face carrying the expression of a man who had done the thing he set out to do. Enforcement suspended, he said. pending full hearing in 90 days from today. Any marshal who tries to execute that warrant before then is acting outside his authority, and I will hold him personally accountable. Wren's legs went unreliable. She sat down on the bench she'd just stood up from, which put her directly next to Reed, who had turned the moment he heard Pruitt's voice and was close enough to put his hand on her arm, which he did, warm and steady. The combination she had started, without intending to associate with things being all right. It's not over, she managed. 90 days isn't. 90 days is 90 days. We didn't have yesterday morning, his voice close, not loud. And 90 days is enough to build something a warrant can't knock over easily. The hearing will be ready for the hearing, Pruitt, matter of fact. You have good evidence, Mrs. Aldcott. The doctor's letter is contemporaneous, written before anyone had a motive to lie. That's the kind of documentation that unravels rushed warrants when a judge actually reads it. He looked at her directly. I'll be at that hearing. Start thinking about who else in Caldwell County knows what you know. She nodded. They rode back toward Dry Creek the following morning. The land looked different, with nothing actively pursuing them. Not a change in the landscape itself, but in the quality of her attention to it, present.
Interested.
The attention of someone who was not already calculating the next exit. She noticed Reed, riding beside her. The quality of his silence, which was comfortable in a way usually wasn't when she was trying to manage someone else's patience. He wasn't managing her. He wasn't waiting for her to produce something. He was just there, alongside, at the same pace, in the same direction. She thought about what he'd said beside the fire. 90 days from now, when there's no warrant left between us. She thought about the shawl on the hook in the spare room and the Bible on the nightstand, and what it meant that a man had opened that room to her, and what it meant that she'd started, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to think of it as hers. They came over the last ridge before the ranch as the sun was finishing its argument with the horizon, and both of them saw it at the same time, the horse at the hitching post in front of the house, government branded. Dark bay, lathered from a hard ride that hadn't been the casual pace of a social call. A man on the porch steps in a long coat despite the heat. Earl in the yard, not quite pointing the shotgun but holding it at an angle that communicated a readiness to make a different decision quickly. Reed's hand went to the rifle across his saddle, then stopped because the rifle was not the thing that was going to solve this. Some instinct deeper than the fear told him that. He looked at Wren. She had already straightened. Her hand had gone to the inside pocket of her coat, where the folded enforcement suspension had been riding since Pruitt handed it to her warm against her ribs the whole way home. 90 days of borrowed time in paper form, thin as a page, solid as anything she'd ever held. Whatever happens, she said. Her voice, even the nurse voice, the voice that refused to let what was happening inside affect what was needed. Outside, thank you for all of it. The room and the fence and the fight you didn't have to pick. Save your thank yous. His eyes were on the man at the porch steps, on Earl, on the horse. We're not finished yet, they rode down. The man in the long coat turned as they came into the yard, not hurried. The unhurried quality of someone who had delivered enough warrants that urgency had long since been replaced by procedure. Reed Calloway, even too. Professional, Marshal Cord. I have a warrant for a Wren Aldcott believed to be on this property. Read this first. Reed had the document out before Paul's horses had full stopped, dismounting in one motion, crossing the yard, holding the folded paper out with a hand that did not shake. Because he was not afraid, or if he was, it had traveled somewhere below the surface of his steadiness and hadn't made it to his hand. Cord took the paper. Ride it again. Earl had not moved. The shotgun maintained its strategic ambiguity. The branded horse shifted its weight and blew through its nose, and otherwise declined to have opinions about federal jurisdiction. Could forge a document like this, not an accusation. A fact being introduced into a conversation. Wire Judge Waverly yourself, Reed said. Fort Worth Courthouse. Ask for the Aldcott emergency filing. Won't take you an hour to confirm it. And I reckon a federal marshal doesn't want to be the man who ignored a legal stay and had to explain himself to a judge afterward. Cord looked at him, then at Wren. He held the look long enough that she understood he was seeing her. Not the warrant. Her. The woman the warrant had followed across 3 states into this yard. Something moved behind his eyes too practiced to call it sympathy, but not nothing either. This is legitimate. said to the document more than to either of them. It is. He folded it along its creases, handed it back, and looked at Wren with the flat professional gaze of a man who had learned to keep his opinions about his own work to himself. 90 days, Mrs. Aldcott. The hat tipped, brief, formal. Use them well. He swung up, rode out, took the road back toward town at a pace that said he had plenty to think about and was not in a hurry to stop thinking it. Earl lowered the shotgun, let out a breath that contained the accumulated patience of several very long hours. Thought he'd never leave. He rubbed his knee. Stood on that porch 2 hours. I offered him coffee 3 times. Man has no social grace whatsoever. Reed looked at him. You held the line. I held it with my knees, protesting the entire arrangement. Earl turned toward the barn, but I held it. The back door of the house opened, and Danny came out at a speed that strongly suggested he had been watching through the window for some time and had been waiting for the precise moment when it was acceptable to stop. He hit Wren around the waist, both arms, full force. The impact of someone who had been holding a very large feeling in a very small body for a very long time and had just received permission to set it down. You came back against her side. You said you would and you did, told you we would. He held on. She let him. Over his head she found Reed's eyes across the yard. He was watching the two of them with the expression she was starting to recognize, the one she'd decided early on she couldn't name yet, except that she was getting closer to a name for it. Closer every day. 90 days, she told Danny, pulling back enough to see his face. We bought ourselves 90 days. That ain't forever. No, Reed, coming across the yard, hand settling on his son's shoulder. But it's 90 days more than we had 2 mornings ago. And we're going to use every one of them, building something that Cord can't tear down when he's back. Danny thought about this with the focused gravity he brought to things that mattered. Then he looked at Wren with the unfiltered directness that had been his hallmark since the day she arrived.
You cried, I cried.
Studying her face. Your eyes are still red. I cry when I'm scared and I cry when something goes right. My body doesn't distinguish between the two very efficiently. That's a dumb thing bodies do. Bodies are frequently dumb, she agreed. Come inside. I'll cook something that isn't dark. That night, after Danny was in bed and Earl had retreated to the bunkhouse and the house had contracted to its night dimensions, Wren stood in the kitchen and looked at the boarded window and thought about what 90 days meant. It meant she was still here and fighting, and the fight had a shape now, and she was not doing it alone. She thought about the shawl on the hook in her room, how she had started, sometime in the last week, to not see it every time she walked in. It was still there. She hadn't moved it. But it had stopped being the first thing she registered. The room had started to hold her alongside the person who'd been there before her, which was not replacing anyone but was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She was accumulating a list of things she didn't have names for yet. She realized, not afraid of that list the way she would have been 3 weeks ago, which was its own kind of information about what was happening to her in this house, at this kitchen table, in this small piece of Texas that had started impossibly and against all reasonable expectation to feel like somewhere she might stay. Outside, the night held its vast, dark silence, and the ranch breathed around the small light of the kitchen lamp. And Wren let herself stand in the middle of it without calculating her next direction. 90 days. She was going to use all of them. The 90 days had a texture Wren hadn't anticipated. Not the texture of waiting, which she'd braced for the way you braced for weather you knew was coming, but the texture of building, deliberate, daily accumulation. Read to Pruett twice a week, not frantic letters, precise ones. Each one advance a specific piece of the case, attaching a specific document, asking a question that Pruett needed answered before the hearing date arrived. The doctor's original statement, notarized properly this time. A letter from a Fort Worth physician willing to review the medical facts independently, without knowing anyone involved, without any stake in the outcome. And eventually, the one that surprised her most, a short, grudging note from Frank Dole himself, written under oath, confirming that no evidence of financial theft had ever existed beyond a grieving woman's accusations spoken once and repeated without verification by everyone who heard it. Dole had left the note at the ranch gate without knocking. No explanation. Just the envelope and his horse disappearing back toward a town before anyone came outside. Reed held it up. Read it twice. set it on the pile of documents they'd been assembling on the kitchen table. Man's building himself a conscience. Seems uncomfortable for him. Consciences usually are when they arrive late. He added the note to the file. Better late than the alternative. The town shifted around them in the small ways. Towns shifted when the collective wind changed direction. Not quickly, not graciously, but detectably. The woman who ran the millinery started nodding to Wren on the street, brief and unsmiling but present, which was different from pointedly looking elsewhere, which had been the previous arrangement. A family at the edge of town who had watched the whole thing from a careful distance began leaving surplus garden vegetables at the ranch gate on Tuesdays. No note. Just zucchini and early tomatoes. The anonymous generosity of people who wanted to express an opinion without having to defend it publicly. Lock Greer left Dry Creek. She heard about it from Earl, who heard about it from the feed store, which was how all information in Dry Creek actually moved regardless of what anyone told themselves about the matter. The medical board inquiry had reached Greer through channels that did not require his cooperation, and he had apparently decided that proactive departure was preferable to accountability. A younger doctor named Whitfield arrived from San Antonio to take the practice on who had heard the odd situation second-hand, and who made a point of introducing himself to Wren at the general store with the deliberate courtesy of someone who wanted his position understood, without requiring a speech about it. Vera Stanton had gone quieter, not remorseful. Wren didn't expect remorse from Vera and didn't particularly want it. Remorse from someone who operated the way Vera operated was usually just strategy wearing a different coat. But quieter, the carrying voice had lost some of its certainty. When her audience stopped reliably organizing itself around her pronouncements, the pronouncements became fewer, because Vera Stanton's particular weapon required targets that stayed still long enough to be struck, and Dry Creek was no longer holding still for her the way it once had. None of this was the same as winning. Wren understood that. The hearing was still coming. The Harwick family's lawyer was still somewhere in the legal machinery. Clara herself was still out there in Caldwell County, carrying a grief that had been aimed at Wren for almost a year. But the 90 days were building something. And building felt different from running, different her hands when she worked. In the way she slept, which was still imperfect but improving. In the way she moved through the ranch, which had shifted from the careful provisional movement of a guest to the grounded habitual movement of someone who knew where things were and why they were there. She had hung her second dress on the hook in the spare room, next to the pale green shawl, not replacing it, alongside it, which was its own small thing she let herself have. Somewhere around day 40 of the 90, Vera Stanton drove her buggy up the road to Callaway Flats, not invited, not apologetic, but alone, which was new for Vera. Alone meant no audience. And Vera without an audience was a different creature than Vera in her natural habitat of witnesses and boardwalk observers. Wren was on the back porch when the buggy came up the road. Reed was inside, visible through the kitchen window, which Vera either didn't register or decided was acceptable. "I've been writing letters," Vera said from the buggy, not climbing down. The maintained height of the vehicle was a power she wasn't willing to surrender. To Austin, to the Harwick family, to people who might be inclined to have opinions about your situation. Wren looked at her and waited. "I could," Vera said, "write different letters." The offer in those words was completely unambiguous. What was being extended was a deal go quietly. Let Vera be the one who made the problem disappear. Let Vera retain the narrative authority over what had happened here, which was what she'd always actually wanted. More than Wren's absence, more than any principled position. She wanted to be the one who decided things. Wren stepped off the porch, not toward Vera, just off the porch, standing on the ground, on her own ground, on the ground of a ranch that had started to belong to her, in every way that mattered except that legal one, which was coming. You wrote to Austin because a woman you didn't know found something good in your town, without asking your permit, stated it. Just stated it. You didn't do it for justice or community standards or any of the things you told yourself while you were doing it. You did it because I existed here without your approval. Vera's face went careful. "I'm not going anywhere." Wren's voice held the same register she used talking to frightened animals, the voice that said the center was held and nothing happening here required panic. "Write whatever letters you need to write. I'm going to Fort Worth in 7 weeks with a doctor's letter and a lawyer and 7 weeks of additional documentation. And I'm going to stand in front of a judge and let him read what actually happened. And when that's done, this is where I'll be. Right here. Whether your letters helped or hurt or did nothing at all. A silence. Vera's hands on the reins were not loose. I spent 4 months being afraid of people like you, Ren said. Of towns like this. And I thought the fear was protecting me. But all it was doing was making running the only option I could see. She looked at Vera Stanton, this woman who had thrown her into the street, and told the story of her ruin to anyone who would listen, who operated through other people's cowardice, because she'd found it reliable fuel. Go home, Vera. The buggy turned around, slowly. With the quality of a retreat that hadn't decided yet whether it was permanent, Reed appeared on the porch behind her. She heard him there, and did not need to turn around to know what his face was doing. Where did that come from, he said. 6 weeks of building something instead of running from something. She watched the dust settling behind Vera's wheels. Turns out changes your center of gravity. The mayor was the one who complicated everything, not directly, not intentionally. Mayors in difficult labor rarely had opinions about the humans affected by their timing. But the fact was that on the day Danny Calloway decided to demonstrate his complete personal authority over his own heat exhaustion by hauling water in the Newfoundland sun of the hottest week remaining in August. Both Reed and Wren were in the back stall of the barn, dealing with a foaling problem that required both her hands and most of her focus and all of his. The mare had been struggling since morning. Wren knew the signs, had seen them in enough contexts to recognize them across species. The combination of distress and effort that meant something was positioned wrong and not correcting itself without help. Reed had come to get her at 9 in the morning, and she'd gone without being asked twice. She worked. Reed worked alongside her, not directing, not flinching, doing exactly what she told him when she told him, handing things at the right angle, holding the light steady when she needed both hands. The ability to be useful without needing to be in charge. The ability to subordinate your instinct, to take over to the fact that someone else knew more than you did, right now. She had learned to value that quality enormously in the time since she'd arrived, because it was rarer than people understood. The foal came in a rush at mid-morning, wet and trembling and alive. Wren sat back against the stall wall. With the collapse that followed hard, successful work, and Reed crouched on the other side of the mare, looking across at her with an expression that had stopped bothering to manage what it meant several weeks ago. You're something else, Wren Eaglecrest. I just did what needed doing. Most folks wouldn't know what needed doing. Most folks haven't had the same education I've had. She pushed herself to standing, brushed the straw off her skirt, looked at the foal finding its legs in the corner of the stall with the determined wobbling effort of something that had just arrived and intended to stay. Then, Reed. Where's Danny? The way his face changed was instantaneous. They were both moving before the sentence was finished, because Danny had gone to the well pump. He'd said so at breakfast, the casual announcement of a 9-year-old, who had decided this was his contribution to the war effort, hauling water to the troughs when the heat was at its worst. He had been going to the well pump since before mid-morning. Neither of them had registered the amount of time that had passed. The barn to the well pump was 40 yards. 40 yards had never felt like distance before. Wren registered him from 30 feet away because of the color of his skin. Wrong. Deeply wrong in the way a body went wrong when the cooling system had failed. The red that meant not sunburn, the dry that meant the sweating had stopped. She'd spent 6 years learning to be afraid of that particular combination. The thing that meant the body had used up its last resort and was now on its own. He was on the ground beside the pump, unconscious. Reed made a sound she had never heard from him before. She was already there, already on her knees. Already with 2 fingers at his neck, pulse rapid and shallow and too fast, skin hot and dry under her hands. Airways clear, thank God, airways clear. Her brain went cold and precise the way it went under pressure, setting aside everything that wasn't immediately useful. Get him inside. She heard her own voice from somewhere ahead of herself, the nurse voice. No edges, no room for the terror underneath it to surface. Cool water, not cold. Towels. The metal basin from the kitchen. Do not use cold water, do you hear me? Cool water. We need to bring his temperature down slowly or we'll send his system into shock. Reed had Danny in his arms and was moving before she'd finished the sentence. She ran ahead to open doors. Inside, they laid him on the kitchen table, the wrong surface, and also the right surface because it was the closest flat expanse with clear access on all sides. Ren went to work with the focused urgency of someone who had been trained for exactly this and was hoping with everything she had that she would never need to use it on this patient. Wet cloths to his neck, his wrists, the insides of his elbows where the blood ran half shallow, and the cooling would move fastest. The basin of water at the right temperature, cool enough to help, without shocking the cardiovascular system that was already working harder than it should. His pulse is too fast and his skin is dry. She did not look up. He's stopped sweating. That's the sign I'm most worried about. His body has given up trying to regulate itself. We have to do it for him until it remembers how. Is he going to Calloway? Sharp, not unkind, precise. I need you fanning him steady, both hands. Don't stop, he obeyed, which was the right thing. Which told her again something she kept learning about him. He was the kind of person that he was the kind some function from somewhere internal and functional rather than letting it into the room where it would be in the way. She talked to Danny while she worked, not loudly. At the register she'd used in the barn with the mare, the voice that said the center was held and the frightened thing could find it if it did to. Come on. Come on back. You're not allowed to be absent this long without permission. Your father has opinions about this, and so do I, and you're going to hear them both when you wake up, and that is a promise. The pulse was wrong, still wrong, but it was there. Earl had appeared in the doorway and taken one look at the situation and gone for water. Without being asked, shuttling the basin back and forth with the silent efficiency of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was also the least dramatic. Doc Greer, Reed said. Greer is gone. She replaced the cloth at Danny's neck with a cooler one. Whitfield. The new doctor, he's in town, then someone needs to ride. Reed looked at Earl. Earl looked at his legs, which were not in a position to ride fast, and then at the door, and said nothing, which was Earl's version of admission. His horse had thrown a shoe 2 days ago, and the replacement wasn't done. I'll ride. Reed looked at Wren. The look of a man about to leave his son with someone and needing to be certain before he did it. Go. She met his eyes directly. I've done this before. I know what I'm doing, he went. She kept working. The minutes were long in the way. Minutes were long when what you needed was for time to move faster than it was moving. She cycled the cloths. She kept talking. She checked the pulse every few minutes and catalogued the changes, looking for the turn, the moment when the body remembered it had resources and started using them again. She taught Thomas Horick how she let herself think it directly, without flinching away. Because she had learned in the last 3 months that flinching from things didn't make them smaller, it just made them more available to ambush at bad moments. She thought about Thomas, about the 71 hours, about what she had done and what it had not been enough to fix. This was different. Danny had been found. He was young and strong and the fever was severe, but it was caught. This was a body that had been asked too much in too much heat for too long. Give it time and cooling and fluid when he was conscious enough to swallow, and most bodies came back from this. Most. Come on, she said again, pressing a fresh cloth to his forehead. You told me you were brave. Prove it by opening your eyes. He didn't open his eyes, but his pulse changed, fractionally. The racing quality settling by the smallest possible margin, a change, so small she wouldn't have caught it if her fingers weren't exactly where they were. Earl appeared in the doorway. Doc Whitfield's on his way. Calloway caught him leaving the office. How long? 20 minutes. She nodded, kept working. The 20 minutes were longer than the previous 20, which had each been longer than the ones before. The math of emergency situations that nobody put in the medical textbooks because it wasn't something you could quantify or fix. You simply lived through it. You kept your hands moving and your voice steady, and you got through it one cloth change at a time. Reed came through the door ahead of Whitfield by 2 steps. He went straight to Danny's side without looking at anything else. His hand went to his son's faced palm flat against the still hot cheek. A touch that was not medical and was not anything other than a father confirming that his child was still in the world. Whitfield was in his 30s and moved with the calm of someone who had trained for exactly this and was not going to waste the training on panic. He assessed quickly. Eyes, pulse, skin temperature, respiration. You've done everything correctly. He said it to Ren directly, checking Danny's pupils with his lamp. The cooling measures, the position, the approach. Whoever trained you well. 6 years of nursing, it shows. He pulled ice from his bag packed in sawdust, a limited supply but present, wrapped it in cloth, applied it to the neck and wrists with precision. This is going to help. His pulse is coming down, slowly, but it's moving the right direction. When it breaks, it needs to break gradually. He glanced at her. You've seen this before, once. With a different outcome, Whitfield's face did something that was not sympathy exactly, but was a recognition of something. I've read the Harwick case, he said, continuing to work, matter of fact. Made a point of reading it before I took this posting. The medical board review was unambiguous. The boy's fever was already at a critical stage before you were called. Nothing available to rural medicine at that time would have changed what happened. The kitchen was very quiet. Reed had looked up from Danny. What the board didn't understand, Whitfield continued, checking Danny's pulse again, was why the warrant was allowed to proceed given the medical evidence. That's a legal question, not a medical one. But from a clinical standpoint, the case against you was always without foundation. He looked at her steadily. I intend to say so in writing to Pruitt before your hearing date. Ren set down the cloth she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed until this moment. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Thank me by letting me do my job. He nodded toward Danny. Talk to him. His body knows your voice by now. That's not nothing, so she talked. And she watched the color in Danny's face begin, over the next 2 hours, to do what she'd been waiting for it to do. The angry red cooling by degrees. The terrible stillness of deep unconscious fever giving way to the slightly different stillness of a body choosing sleep over crisis. And at some point in the mid-afternoon, with the kitchen lights slanting differently and the worst of the summer heat starting its slow daily retreat, Danny's skin went damp, not the dry, terrible heat of before. Damp. Whitfield put his fingers to Danny's pulse and said, "That's the turn." Reed closed his eyes. Just for a moment. The expression on his face in that moment was the most unguarded thing Ren had ever seen from him. All the control he carried as default suspended for 1 second, everything he felt about his son, visible without modification. Then his eyes opened and he pressed his mouth to Danny's forehead and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed to be said, because the boy's chest was rising and falling in the steady rhythm of someone who had come through something and was resting now. Reed looked at Ren across the table. She looked back at him. No words happened. None were adequate, and both of them understood that simultaneously. Danny woke in the late afternoon, confused at first. The underwater confusion of coming back from the kind of sleep a fever leaves behind, blinking at the ceiling, then at his father, then at Ren. What happened? You got too hot. She kept her voice level. No drama. He didn't need drama right now. Your body couldn't regulate itself anymore. You passed out by the well pump. Danny processed this with the furrowed concentration of someone receiving information about themselves from the outside. How long was I out? Most of the day. His eyes went wide. I missed. Everything's handled. Reed, one hand still on his son's arm, not letting go yet. Nothing you needed to be awake for. I was going to help with the south fence. The south fence survived your absence. Danny looked at Ren. Something in his face was working through something. You stayed with me. Of course I stayed with you. You didn't have to. Yes, she said, and her voice had the quality it sometimes got when something true arrived, plain and without decoration. I did. He held her gaze for a moment with the serious dark eyes that were his own, not his father's, not anyone else's. Then he reached out and put his small hand over hers where it rested on the table edge. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. Whitfield packed his bag in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had seen a lot of sick rooms and was capable of reading what was in this one. He'll need quiet and water and nothing strenuous for a week. His body did significant work today. He picked up his bag. I'll bring a written statement to the ranch before the hearing. Not as a character witness, as a colleague providing clinical context. You should have it in hand before you walk into that courtroom. Thank you, Ren said. Don't thank me for doing my job correctly, said with the mild firmness of someone who had opinions about what that phrase meant. Greer made a choice I won't make. That's not heroism. That's the minimum requirement. He left. Earl, who had been in the kitchen doorway for the last exchange, cleared his throat with the production of a man who had something to say, and was taking the scenic route to it. Somebody going to feed this family? Or are we all going to stand around in a medical drama till the cows figure out nobody's coming? I'll cook, Wren said. You've been on your feet since before dawn. I'll cook faster than you. Earl opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her for a moment with the flat assessing look he gave things he'd decided he respected. Fair, he said, and went to check the cattle. Reed ate, standing that first hour, not willing to move far from Danny's eye line. Wren sat at the table and ate without tasting much of what she put in her mouth, which was fine, because the function food right now was maintenance rather than experience. Late that night, after Danny had slept and woken and slept again, after the house had gone through its evening contractions and the kitchen lamp was the only light burning, Wren sat at the table and listened to the ranch settle around her. She thought about Thomas Hurrick, not the way she'd been thinking about him for 11 months, not the flinching memory, not the version where his death was evidence of her permanent inadequacy. She let herself think about him fully. The 3 days, the 71 hours, what she'd done and what had happened anyway. She'd been carrying the weight of it as proof that she wasn't allowed to love people too hard, because loving them too hard meant being responsible for them, and being responsible for them meant failing them. Danny's chest rose and fell in the next room. She sat with that for a long time. One loss did not have to be the permanent testimony of her capability. One tragedy did not have to mark every future room she'd walked into with the expectation of disaster. She had known that abstractly for a while, the way you knew things that hadn't yet made it from the brain to the blood. Tonight something had moved. She had sat with a child through the worst of a fever and done the right things, and he had come back, and the world had not arranged the outcome to punish her for caring. She had not been punished for staying. She was still here. The footsteps in the hall were Reed's, distinct and familiar by now, the cadence of a man who moved through his own house with the unconscious ease of someone who'd built it or might as well have. They stopped at the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. Sit down, Reed. He sat across from her. The lamp between them threw the kitchen in uneven gold, the kind of light that made everything look like something that would be remembered later. I almost lost him. The words came out direct, without attempt at management. This was what he'd had stored up since the afternoon and was now setting down. And in the same day I kept thinking I might lose you too. To a warrant that doesn't care what kind of person you actually are. And I don't know what a man's supposed to do with being that scared twice in the same afternoon. You survive it, she said. Same as I did. His hand moved across the table and found hers without ceremony. Not reaching for it, finding it the way you find something in the dark that you already know is there. I said, 90 days. His voice was rough at the edges in a way she hadn't heard before. Said I'd wait until the warrant was gone and you were choosing me clear. And I meant it, Wren. I still mean it. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. But I nearly lost everything I had today. And I find I'm not willing to be 40-some days from now with you not knowing what that means to me. She looked at his hand over hers. This ranch, he said. Danny. The room at the end of the hall, a pause. None of it means what it means without you in the middle of it. That's not gratitude. It's not the fear from today talking or any other temporary thing. He met her eyes and held them. That's just what's true. She thought about all the things she'd been telling herself in the 4 months before this ranch and in the weeks since arriving. About not letting herself want things she might not get to keep. About the self-protective logic of a woman who had lost enough to develop a policy about loss. About the night by the fire on the road to Fort Worth when she'd told him she might already know her answer, and he'd told her to wait anyway. She had waited. She was still waiting, technically. The warrant was still out there with 40 days left on the suspension. But I've spent 4 months believing I wasn't allowed to want anything this good, she said. Because wanting it meant it could be taken, and everything I loved had already been taken, or had taken itself, or had been aimed at me, by someone I'd made the mistake of trusting. Reed didn't interrupt, and then I watched Danny come back from something that shouldn't have been close. Her voice was steady, not because she wasn't feeling what she was feeling, but because she'd found a way to feel things and stay present at the same time, which was a skill set that had cost her a long education to develop. and I realized I'd been doing something. I'd been punishing the future for what the past had done to me. Danny didn't stop loving things because his mother died. He loved harder, angrier sometimes. But harder, she turned her hand under his until their palms were together. I think I'm done punishing the future. His fingers closed around hers. Nothing else happened. Nothing else needed to. They sat like that while the lamp burned lower, and outside the Texas dark held its immensity. And the ranch breathed round them in the rhythm of a place that had been waiting for something, and had just been told it could stop. The hearing date in Fort Worth arrived on a morning that was finally tentatively beginning to smell like September. The brutality of August had not released its grip entirely, but had loosened it by degrees the way Texas let go of things, reluctantly and with conditions. The air had a different quality, not cool, but no longer actively trying to kill anything that stood still. Reed was up before her. He had coffee made and the horses saddled and was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking at the table in the way of a man who had been going over something in his head for a while and had not finished going over it. She came in and he turned. Then he did something she hadn't expected, reached out and took hold of both her hands and held them between his. Not romantic exactly, more fundamental than that. The way you hold something you're afraid of losing your grip on. Whatever happens in that courtroom today, he said, you are not what they said you were. I need you to know that I know that before we walk in. Not because the judge agrees, because it's true regardless of what the judge does. Her throat closed briefly. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder for one moment, just one. Then, let's go in. Danny at the gate, arms crossed, chin set, the stance of a boy who had opinions about this departure and had decided to communicate them non-verbally. You're coming back with the right news. That's the plan, Reed said. Plans aren't guarantees, no, but they're better than nothing. Danny looked at Ren. Something passed through his face that was older than 9. You fought for me when I was sick. Now I need you to fight for yourself the same way. She reached out and gripped his shoulder once, brief and certain. Watch, Earl, she said. He pretends his back is fine when he's been lifting. Danny nodded, the brisk nod of someone accepting a mission. Go they went. Pruitt them outside the Fort Worth courthouse with the focused energy of a man who had spent the last 6 weeks preparing for exactly this and was ready to stop preparing and start doing. He reviewed the final document stack with them in the courthouse hallway before they went in, quick and efficient, his hands moving through the papers with the ease of someone who knew where everything was because he'd placed it there deliberately. Whitfield's written statement had arrived at Pruitt's office 4 days earlier, 2 pages of clinical language that translated it into one inescapable conclusion. The warrant had no medical foundation. Pruitt had already filed it with the court. Judge Waverly is fair. He looked at Wren. He reads what's in front of him, which is more than you can say for the man who signed the original warrant. The Harwick family has Coburn representing them money and aggression. What they don't have evidence. Remember that. Your evidence is contemporary. Theirs is emotional. Contemporary beats emotional in Waverly Source courtroom, and if it doesn't, it will. Spread without the false brightness of someone telling you what you want to hear. Said the way someone stated something they'd verified to their own satisfaction. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined and larger than it needed to be. The way important rooms often were, as though the architecture was trying to compensate for the weight of what happened inside it. Benches. A high window. The smell of old paper and procedure. The Harwick family's lawyer, Coburn, was already there. Late 40s. Expensive suit. The face of a man who had won enough that winning had become his baseline expectation. He looked at Wren when she came in with the evaluating look of someone assessing an opponent's resources before the match began, and apparently concluded that what he was looking at was not going to present serious difficulty. She did not change her expression. Because her expression was not for him, Clara Harwick was in the gallery. Still in her mourning clothes, the deep black she'd been wearing the last time Wren had seen her, in the Caldwell County kitchen, in the first hours of the morning after Thomas died. She was thinner. Her face was the face of someone who had been living inside grief for long enough that grief had started to become the structure rather than the weather. Wren looked at her directly. Clara looked away. The proceedings opened. Coburn made his opening statement with the polished fluency of a man who had practiced it enough to make it sound unrehearsed. A child had died. A nurse had been present and in charge. The family wanted accountability. The law demanded consequences. Then he called Clara Harwick to testify. Clara's voice on the stand was not the practiced voice of a coached witness. It was raw, the rawness of someone who had spent 17 months keeping something under control and was now being asked, in a formal setting, to let it out. She described Thomas's final days with the detail of a mother who had memorized every moment because those moments were all she had left. The progression of the fever, the nights, the way he'd called for her, the way his hand had felt in hers when it stopped being warm, and then the moment when he stopped. Wren sat through it, did not look away, because Clara Harwick's grief was real. It had always been real. The grief was not the problem. The grief was not what had followed Wren across 3 states. It was what the grief had been turned into the warrant and the accusations and the theft lie that was the problem. But the grief itself, the original source of all of it, was the genuine article. Pruitt rose for cross-examination with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that what he was about to do needed to be done gently and precisely. Mrs. Harwick, in the weeks following Thomas's death, did you review the medical documentation Mrs. Eaglecrest left with your family physician? Clara's jaw tightened. I couldn't, so your warrant was filed based on your experience of the events as you understood them, not based on a review of the clinical record. She was supposed to save him. Yes, Pruitt's voice was not unkind. And the question before this court is whether she failed or whether she performed that duty correctly in the face of a disease that had progressed beyond what any nurse or physician could reverse. He held up the doctor's letter. This letter was written 8 days after Thomas's death, before any legal proceedings, before anyone had a reason to construct a version of events. It states that the fever was already at a critical stage before Mrs. Eaglecrest was called. Is that information you were given at the time? Clara's hands were folded in her lap. Mantop. I was told she couldn't save him. That is not the same thing as being told it was impossible to save him. Pruitt let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. No further questions, Your Honor. Coburn redirected. He was good. He pushed the angle that Wren's departure from Caldwell County the night Thomas died was itself evidence of guilt, the logic of flight, the argument that innocent people stayed and explained themselves, and Wren, who had been sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood because they needed something to press against, who had been listening to the account of her own life and the terrible night at its center, who had thought she was prepared for this and was discovering that prepared and ready were not the same things. She spoke without standing. Directly to the judge, because he was the only person in the room whose opinion had legal weight. I left because I had just watched a child die in my arms after doing everything I knew how to do, and his mother was telling me I had killed him not 10 minutes after his last breath. Her voice was level. The nurse voice, but underneath it something else, something that was just her, without management or modification. I left because staying meant being blamed for a grief too large for anyone to carry correctly. Not because I was guilty. Because I couldn't help him from inside a grief that had decided to make itself mine. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Waverley looked at her for a long moment. He was 60-something, with the weathered patience of a man who had heard a great many things said in this room and had developed the ability to identify when something was being said that was simply true. That statement will stand, he said. Pruitt called Whitfield next. The young doctor testified with the flat clinical precision of someone who had no personal stake in the outcome and wanted that understood. He had reviewed the complete medical record. He had reviewed the original doctor's letter. He had consulted with 2 colleagues in Fort Worth. The fever's progression, as documented in the contemporaneous record, indicates a disease process already in its final stage before Mrs. Eaglecrest was called to the Harwick household. He looked at the judge directly. The interventions she performed were correct. The quinine she procured at her own expense was the appropriate pharmaceutical response. The outcome was determined before she arrived. A pause. In my professional opinion, the warrant in this matter represents a failure to distinguish between a tragedy and a negligent act. They are not the same thing. They can feel like the same thing. They are not. Coburn objected to various things. Waverley overruled most of them. The room felt different by the time both sides had finished. The law did not traffic in dramatic differences, it traded in the slow accumulation of the record, the weight of documents and testimony building towards something that the judge then translated into consequence. Waverley reviewed his notes for 2 minutes that stretched and stretched. Then he looked up. This court finds insufficient evidence to sustain a charge of negligence causing death. The warrant against Wren Eaglecrest is dismissed with prejudice. It shall not be refilled on these grounds by any party in any jurisdiction. Dismissed with prejudice, not revisable, not reopenable, not something that could be dressed differently and brought back to done. Wren put both hands flat on the table and pressed down and closed her eyes for 3 seconds, because if she didn't do something with the force of what was happening, it was going to come out somewhere she hadn't chosen. Then she opened her eyes. Reed was right there. Right there because he'd been there the whole time and was not going anywhere. Clara Harrick approached them in the corridor outside the courtroom while the crowd was still dispersing. She moved with the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision and was going to carry it out before she could unmake it. "I owe you something," she said. "Not to Reed. To Wren. I know what it's worth given everything, but I owe it." Wren looked at her, at the thinness, at the grief that had not left her face and was not going to leave it, not fully, not ever, which was the true nature of losing a child. "You needed somewhere to put what happened," Wren said. "I understand that. I'm not sure I forgive it yet, but I understand it." Clara's eyes filled. She didn't cry, but they filled. "I didn't know about the medicine," she said. "What you spent?" "James never told me." Of course James hadn't told her. "It didn't matter to me at the time," Wren said. "It still doesn't." She paused. "I hope you find somewhere better to put the grief. Clara, for your own sake." Clara nodded, turned away, and her grief, no longer propped up by blame, was finally just what it had always, painful and private and entirely hers to carry. They rode back toward Dry Creek in the afternoon, and the land looked different with nothing pursuing them. Not a change in the landscape itself, but in the quality of her attention to it. Present, interested, the attention of someone who was not already calculating the next exit. She was going to be here tomorrow. She was going to wake up in the spare room that was becoming her room and cook breakfast in the kitchen that was becoming her kitchen and live in a life that was becoming, piece by piece, hers. Dry Creek watched them come in. Word had moved faster than they had the way news moved in small places. The people on the boardwalk who turned down as the wagon rolled past were not the same configuration of faces she'd faced before. Holt came out of his store and stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides, which was not an apology, but was not the crossed-arm calculation of before either. The woman from the millinery nodded with something warmer in it than the previous weeks had carried. Vera Stanton was in the window of the inn, watching. Wren looked at her, held the look for the full length of the moment it lasted, did not look away first, did not perform anything, did not require anything from Vera's face in return, then looked forward and let the wagon carry her past. Some things did not resolve cleanly. Some people didn't reconstruct themselves into something better because the evidence pointed that way. Vera Stanton was probably going to be Vera Stanton for the duration, and Wren was going to live in this town, and that was going to create a friction that would require managing. She could manage it. She had learned to manage harder things than a small-town woman's inconvenient grudge. Earl had supper going when they arrived, either a miracle or the result of a man who'd been too restless to sit still and had channeled it into the only productive activity available. He looked up from the stove when they came in, read their faces, and went back to the pot without saying anything, which for Earl was its own kind of celebration. Danny launched himself at the door the moment he heard the wagon, and arrived in the kitchen at a run, skidding slightly on the loose floorboard, catching himself on the counter, looking at Wren with a face that contained the question she hadn't finished asking before she said, dismissed. His exhale was audible. Then he straightened and reformed his face into something more composed. Obviously, she agreed. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, the way O held on to something you were glad was still there, and she held him back, and Reed stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them with the expression she had a name for now. Had had a name for it for a while. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. That evening, after it had been debriefed on every detail of the courthouse, proceedings with the thoroughness of a congressional inquiry, after Earl had produced his flask and distributed it without ceremony. After the supper dishes had been cleared, and the lamp lit against the early dark that September brought with it, Reed found her on the porch. She had not gone there because she needed air. She had gone there because she wanted to look at the land in the dark, at Callaway Flats in the quality of the early autumn night, at the stars that had been there all along, over all the roads she'd run down. He sat beside her. He had something in his hand, a photograph, small, slightly worn at the edges. He held it for a moment before he spoke. "I've carried this in my coat for 3 years. His voice was quiet and direct, the register he used when he decided something and was stating it rather than testing it. Not because I couldn't put it down. Because I thought putting it down meant letting go of something I wasn't ready to let go of." She looked at the photograph. A young woman laughing, holding an infant that was recognizably Danny in the loose-limbed way of babies who hadn't yet figured out that gravity was permanent. She was good, he said. She was a good woman and she loved Danny, and she'd have had plenty of opinions about the state of this ranch that I haven't been willing to hear because it would have meant acknowledging she was gone. He turned the photograph over once in his hands. "I'm not putting this away because I've stopped loving what it is. I'm putting it away because I've found room in this life for both things. What was here and what's here now." He slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket, breastlock pocket, close, but not in his hand anymore. "Those aren't the same room and they don't have to be." Wren looked at the dark line of the hills, Wren Eaglecrest. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the porch light was small, and the dark was vast, and neither of those things mattered at all. "I have been patient because you deserved patience, and because I told myself I would be, and because 90 days felt like the right distance from everything that was chasing you. The 90 days are gone. What's chasing you is gone, and what's left is what's been here the whole time." His hands found hers. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not performance, not negotiation." A question asked by someone who had already accepted both possible answers, and was asking anyway because the asking was its own necessary act. She looked at him. At this man who had crouched down in the dirt of a street where she had nothing and treated her like someone who had everything she needed to be taken seriously. Who had stood in front of a carrying-voiced woman and said that what he'd seen of Dren outweighed what he'd been told. Who had ridden 2 days to Fort Worth and held a light steady in a dark barn and sat on a courthouse bench without offering false comfort. Who had left room in his life for both things. "Yes," she said, "Reed Callaway." Yes, he kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that happened after everything else had already happened, which meant it had nothing to prove and nothing to establish, which meant it was just what it was. The first unhurried moment either of them had had in longer than they could measure, huh? When they finally broke apart, Wren found herself laughing, the sound giddy and slightly disbelieving, at the impossible turn her life had taken since the day she'd knelt in the dust of Dry Creek's Main Street with nothing left to her name but a suitcase and a stranger's unexpected decency. "Danny's going to have opinions about this," she said. "Danny's going to be insufferable about it," Reed corrected, still smiling. "He's been asking when I'd get around to it for weeks. Boy has no patience whatsoever." They told him the next morning, and true to his father's prediction, Danny received the news with the serene satisfaction of a child convinced he'd orchestrated the entire outcome himself. "Finally," he said, arms crossed, surveying them both with immense approval. "I was starting to think I'd have to arrange it myself." "You had nothing to do with this," Reed said. "I had everything to do with this." "Who do you think told her our horse was mean? Who kept asking when she was leaving so you'd have to say she wasn't? You also got a split lip defending her honor. That was unrelated." A pause. "Partially unrelated." Earl's response was to pour his coffee and say into his cup, without looking at anyone, "About time. Man's been obvious about it since the first week. I have not been obvious, Callaway. I've known you 15 years. You don't linger in kitchens when there's nothing in the kitchen you need." Reed opened his mouth, closed it. Earl went back to his coffee with the air of someone who had delivered his complete position on the matter and considered the discussion closed. The wedding was 3 weeks later, not the church in town, not a church at all. The ceremony happened on the porch of Callaway Flats on a Saturday morning in early October when the sky had finally committed to the clear blue of the Texas fall. a traveling minister who held no allegiance to Creek's internal politics and no opinions about the couple beyond the ceremony he'd been asked to perform. Earl stood witness. Danny stood beside his father in his one good shirt with his arms at his sides like a soldier at formal attention. Several people from town came. Not everyone. Some absences were expected and did not require more than a moment's acknowledgement. Whitfield came because he had wanted to and said so. Frank Dole stood near the back with his hat in both hands, a man still figuring out how to exist in the aftermath of his own choices, but at least facing in the right direction. Pruitt sent a letter and the framed copy of the dismissed warrant with a note, "Hang this where it can be seen, not as a trophy, as proof of what it costs to build something worth having." Reed had hung it in the front hallway that morning. The vows were not elaborate. Which was right, because elaborate would have been wrong for two people who had found each other through the specific violence of everything being stripped away until only the true things were left. Reed, I promise you a home that will never throw you back into the dust. A room that is permanently yours. A life where nobody gets to decide who you are before you've had the chance to show them. And a man who will keep his word even when his curiosity is killing him. I promise I'll never run again. Not from you, not from this ranch, not from whatever comes next. I spent 4 months believing I wasn't allowed to want anything this good. You proved me wrong. One fence post and one splinter, and one genuine look at eye level at a time. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. Danny stepped forward before anyone else could speak and announced to the assembled gathering, "Nobody in this town objects." "I already checked with everybody who matters." The small crowd laughed. Reed pulled his son into a rough sideways hug that Danny pretended to resist for exactly 1 second before abandoning the pretense entirely. At the table afterward, set outside in the October light, Danny stood up on his chair. He did not ask permission. He simply stood and waited for the noise level to acknowledge him, which it did. "I want to say something," he said, Earl, under his breath. "Lord help us. When she first came here, everybody in town said she was trouble. Said Pa was out of his mind for bringing her home." He looked at the people gathered, then at Wren. "She stopped a horse from trampling me. She fixed my hand. She stayed up all night when I was sick, even with a warrant out there with her name on it. She didn't leave, even when leaving was the only thing she knew how to do." A pause. The table went quiet. "I don't remember my ma that well anymore." Something honest and undefended moved through his voice. "But I think she would have said that Wren was exactly the kind of person worth keeping." No one spoke for a moment. Then Whitfield raised his cup without ceremony. Earl raised his. The rest of the table followed about a woman who had arrived in Dry Creek with nothing but a cracked suitcase hinge and a chin that wouldn't go down, and who had turned out, against all the town's early assessments, to be precisely what she'd always been, the kind of person worth keeping. 6 months later. March, the Texas cold had released its grudging hold, and the land at Callaway Flats was doing what it did every spring, greening up quietly and without announcement, the grass coming back in the way of things that had always planned to come back and was simply waiting for the conditions to support it. Wren. The porched steps in the early morning Effie with coffee in her hands, and the light still low and soft, the quality of light that arrived before the day had declared its full intentions. Her hand rested in her lap in a particular way, not deliberately, just where it had settled. She heard the barn door, Reed's steps across the yard. She did not turn around. He came around the side of the house and stopped. He had looked at her the same every morning for 6 months, the look of a man who still found the fact of her here slightly astonishing, and had decided not to be embarrassed about it. But this morning he stopped differently. His eyes went to her hand, to the way it rested, to something in the angle of her that he read with the same directness he read everything. "Wren, April," she said, not looking up yet, feeling the words sit in the morning air. "Doc Whitfield," says April. She heard him come up the steps, sit down beside her, one arm coming around her shoulders with the uncalculating certainty of something that had become habit, the best kind of habit. They looked at the land together, the grass coming in, the hills in the distance beginning to hold a different color as the season changed, the barn that leaned slightly one side and had been doing so for years and was apparently not done being useful despite that, the corral, the well pump, the fence line on the north pasture that they had strung together, the two of them, On one of the first days, with wire that fought them both, the back door opened. Danny appeared still in the morning disarray of a 9-year-old who had been awake for approximately 4 minutes and stopped in the kitchen doorway looking out at his parents on the porch with the expression of someone assessing a situation. His eyes went to Wren's hand, to Reed's arm around her shoulders. He was quiet for one moment, which for Danny was notable. Then he straightened, crossed his arms, and addressed them both with the complete authority of a child who had decided long ago that this family was his project, and the outcomes were therefore his business. "Took you long enough," he said. Wren laughed. The kind of laugh that happened when you were not doing anything except being exactly where you were, with exactly the people you were with. On a morning in early March, on a porch in Texas, with the grass coming in green and the hills going soft in the distance, and nothing pursuing you from behind. The kind of laugh that didn't know it was being stored, but it was every piece of it, at Callaway Flats, on a mend of Texas land that was not remarkable by any measure except that it was the place where a woman had finally stopped running. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.